Welcome to the Outthinker podcast. Each week, we talk with forward-looking strategists and innovators that are challenging the status quo, leading the future of business, and shaping our world. I'm your host, Kyan Krippendorf, founder of the Outthinker Strategy Network. Venkat Ramaswamy is a professor of marketing at the Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan. He is a globally recognized thought leader, idea practitioner, and an eclectic scholar of a wide range of interests, including innovation, strategy, marketing, branding, IT operations, and the human side of the organization. Venkat's award-winning book, which he published in 2004, The Future of Competition, which he co-authored with the late C.K.Prahalad, introduced co-creation as a revolutionary concept. I personally came across that book a decade ago, and it deeply influenced how I think about and research strategy. It provided a new frame of reference for jointly creating value through experienced environments and called for a process of co-creation, the practice of developing offerings through ongoing collaboration with customers, employees, managers, financiers, suppliers, partners, and other stakeholders. In their articles, the popular Harvard Business Review article, Co-opting Customer Experience, which they published in 2000, and in 2003, the MIT-PwC award-winning Sloan Management Review article, The New Frontier of Experience Innovation, they envisioned an individual and experience-centric view of interactive value creation and innovation. Venkat's 2010 book, The Power of Co-Creation, showed how enterprises in over 20 industry sectors were all leveraging platforms to create new interactions with people everywhere in the system, and how new forms of value can be created together with individuals through a focus on human experiences. His current work is centered around co-creating systemic transformation and creating positive impact on well-being, wealth, and welfare through platforms and digital societal ecosystems that afford the enactment of interactional creation by engaging and organizing actors. In this podcast, he shares how digital technologies such as IoT, edge computing, and AI are forcing us to fundamentally reconceptualize strategy. Why we should be thinking of experiences rather than products and experiencers rather than customers, and what it takes to flip the mindset of yourself, of your leadership, of your company to be ready for the future of competition. Ladies and gentlemen, Venkat Ramaswamy. Venkat, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
So I want to open up with the same question I ask every guest, just to get the audience to know you a little bit personally. If you can complete this sentence for me, if you really know me, you know that.
I'm really interested and always thinking about the future of innovation and value creation around experiences. And that actually also happens in my family because we're constantly thinking about how do we redesign our own experiences with the world. So there are always situations that come up. We talk about it, and then we get into broader discussions about rethinking design from a humanity and planetary perspective. And really it goes back to because in our Indian spiritual traditions, I'm actually an avid reader of Indian philosophy. It's called Vedanta, which actually looks at experience from a highly cosmic perspective. So I've always been interested in the philosophical foundations of human experience. And that's what has actually driven all my research.
Yeah, that's fascinating. We named our daughter, with 3 children, her middle name is Maya, from the veil of reality.
Exactly.
I think that the metaverse is like a new Hinduism, I think, almost, right?
Yeah, it is, I think, extending that. Happy to talk about that.
We'll get into that. Yes, we should definitely get this. One more question I want to ask, as I ask all guests before we get into the meat of it, is what is your definition of strategy?
My definition of strategy, being heavily influenced by working with C.K.Prahalad, which is really how I got interested in strategy, is I would say a strategy is really about leveraging resourced capabilities to innovate and create valuable well-being impacts in expansive ways. I've tried to choose the words very carefully.
Yes, I can tell.
So I think there's the theme about resource capabilities, notion of leveraging it to innovate and create value, but really value as it is actually experienced. And in terms of not just outputs and outcomes, but impact. So that's part of the definition I made. And then looking at it broadly in terms of well-being. When I say well-being, I mean personal well-being, but also biological, psychological well-being, but also social, collective well-being, and of course, economic and ecological well-being. So in the broadest sense of the word, and really figuring out new pathways by which we can continue to expand this frontier of innovation value creation, which is really being afforded by all of these advances that we're seeing in our digital technology.
Fascinating. fascinating. So in my mind, I see 6 components. You have resources, which comes from resource-based view, RBV, view of strategy, value creation. So you got the value stick. You have innovation, the differentiation, and that's kind of where strategy often ends. And so what you've added here is experiences, impact, and well-being.
Absolutely. Because I think what has fascinated me is that I am now focused less on the process of strategy and more on the content of strategy, but the content really focusing on how we are in a whole new world, I would say, of value creation, innovation. And we really have to fundamentally rethink how value really gets created in the interactive world in which we're in. Because in the old world, I'm here from Detroit, you start with steel, you make a car, and the entire kind of Porterian paradigm, which was the value chain, are the set of activities that take all these raw materials inputs and create outputs, goods and services. And that still holds. That supply of value chain doesn't go away. But implicit in it is that we are creating goods and services that are delivered to customers and other stakeholders. But that is now actually only part of this huge ecosystem of value creation we are in, thanks to digitalization, which is really centered around interactions. And so while the original value chain was focused on activities, which are there, these activities have become interactivities. So when you start looking at it in terms of these relational ecosystems and then use that as a unit of analysis, then you can be anywhere in the ecosystem. And thanks to digitalization, since the products and services themselves have become smart and connected, you're really talking about now creating software, creating digitalized experiences. This wasn't there before. And so in this new world of digitalized experiences, right? So not just purely digital, you can go all the way from purely digital to physical experiences, which are augmented by digital technology. So if you take the entire continuum, you talked about the metaverse before, going from virtual experiences that people are talking about today, 3D virtual worlds. But if you look at the physical world has been augmented by computing and creating new digitalized experiences. And now the physical world is also being embedded in computing itself, which is the virtual worlds and the virtual reality and augmented reality. And then you have like digital twins of our own experiences now, right? If you think about it, we can even create a digital twin of our health. There are lots of initiatives now, for example, in India, where you can create your own view of yourself. So it's not just digital twin in enterprises, but also of individuals. And then you have the whole creator economy, which actually allows everybody to be a creator. You know, you're here doing this podcast as a creator. So I think this whole world just opens up a whole new world of opportunities to me. And so we really, when you think about strategy and strategizing, I like to keep that aside and say, okay, let's first talk about how this world of value creation innovation is shifting so that the way in which you think about opportunities might change and that you don't have to own all of these resources you had to before. You can have access to and leverage resource capabilities from the ecosystem that you don't have to actually have competence in. So you can take capabilities as a service from others and plug it into your quote unquote value chain and enhance the way in which you create value. So it's really about expanding the pie.
Got it. So to bring it to something kind of personal, what I'm thinking is I've just moved myself from the New York area to Miami. And we have all of these different vendors, you know, one person that does the unpacking, the other one that puts the pudding away, the other person that does the packing, the other person that does shipping, another person moves the cars. And honestly, it has been a mess coordinating those. But what I hear from you here and from your work is that for some reason, it's now easier to coordinate these different components. You're able to deliver a composite experience or value from multiple providers. Is that right? And if so, why is it easier to coordinate an ecosystem now?
Yeah, so let's step back. There are a couple of things. Let me unpack in what you said. So it is true that you can try to coordinate it from the perspective of an enterprise. But for a moment, let's put that aside and let's talk about Kai Han and his experience of moving. I try to use colors just so that people can follow along. You know, if I use the color blue, I'm really looking at the experience from the provider's perspective. I'll use the color yellow in this conversation to talk about the same set of experiences from the perspective of the individual. I prefer to use the word experiencer rather than user.
Experiencer, I love it.
But I want to really have people thinking about the moments of experience when you actually engage now with all of those entities in the network, you know, when you were trying to do your packing, unpacking, all of that, right? And the point is that every one of your interactions would have triggered, I would imagine, different sets of entities in that network that you're talking about. And so it's actually very interesting, right? So on the one hand, you have this ability ability from the supply side perspective, if you will, to be able to orchestrate all of these resource capabilities in new ways. So that's one. But then on the other hand, you really have to focus on how an individual engages with that ecosystem because experiences are emergent. So they emerge from all of the interactions you have, and you do not know how Kaihan is going to interact because it depends on Kaihan's context in which you're moving, which might trigger and activate certain resources in that system, certain capabilities. And those interactions drive your experiences and will then lead you to tweet it and engage in social media with the other yellows in your network, which is often outside the purview of anybody in that, but which now feeds back into the system. So your quality of your experiences feeds back into the system. So the other thing to unpack is that quality of the experience is distinct from the innovation of the type of experience, or what I call the environments in which you are having these new experiences, right? When you are going online and you are essentially engaging with one of these services and you're conveying your needs, etc. So at every point of interaction, it's almost at every moment of interaction, there is a network that is generated on demand from the blue side. And then you, as an experiencer, and you might have different contexts, will drive that interaction with that network in different ways, which makes it very challenging depending upon where you are, what you're trying to accomplish, and what I call the lived journey is, right? Because you are in your own journey and moving is only one part of it. You have other things going on in your life. And so you are going to engage from that context. I think the opportunity and the challenge for all of us is how do you balance this all? So you took a moving example. Let me take an example of education. So on the blue side, I'm actually wearing blue today as a professor, right? So if you take education, the blue would be essentially teaching. The yellow would be thinking of learning, how an individual learns. So the same business, education now, we need to look at it two ways, right? One is what is from the teaching side, the resource capabilities, what is the ecosystem I can bring so that I can create new forms of experience, new types of learning experiences for the learner. Pandemic has forced us to shift from a campus-centric model to really looking at where and how people want to learn, right? Remotely from home and so on. So that's one part, right? The entire new digitalized ecosystem of teaching and learning. But you equally have to now think very deeply about how individuals as learners, how do they want to experience education, right? From their own learning journey, where they are in their lifelong learning, and they have access to many other platforms through which they can learn, and they are also connected with their own peers, the yellow to yellow interactions. So the yellow to yellow has to be then brought back into the blue and blue to blue, which is the ecosystem. And I always say that it's really the mixing of the yellow and blue. And when you mix those two colors, guess what you get?
Green. Okay.
Now, green is the color of course, the US greenback, the dollar. So it creates economic impact, but it's also the color of sustainability. Hence, they're linked to impacts in terms of well-being. So I just use this as a simple way for us to constantly think about how do you mix the yellow and the blue in these new ways. And so it puts the spotlight on redesigning interactions and engagements in the system. So I have this lens that I typically use where I put engagement in the center. On the yellow side, I put the experiencer. On the blue side, I put the ecosystem. So you have the experiencer, the engagement, and the ecosystem, right? So that's at the core, but it's really powered from the bottom by platforms, and it leads to impacts at the top. So I call this the PyX lens, where X stands for the experiencer and the experiences that emerge from those interactions. But this is very, very different than drawing like value chain arrows and optimizing inputs, outputs, processes, which you still have to do, but that's not where the value is anymore. It's more in all these fluid flows of data and services, right? And content in the system that is unleashing new forms of value.
Yes. So I'm really curious to understand. It seems like there's a cognitive leap or shift that we need to make from imagining a value chain as being a linear left to right to this different, whatever that metaphorical frame is. But before we go there, can you explain why that is happening? I've heard IoT, connected devices. I imagine there's data. There is experiencer to experiencer communication, lowering of transaction costs. But what is your explanation for why now and not 10 years ago or 20 years ago?
One way to think about it is through the 4 industrial revolutions. We are supposedly in the 4th industrial revolution. So if you think of the first industrial revolution, right, we all know driven by steam railroads, right? And then you have electric power, which drove the second one. And then the third one is really computer power, starting from mainframes and so on. And now essentially what has happened in the 4th industrial revolution, that's really about data power, right? Data is the heart of it. And one way to think about it is that it's really less about computers now than computing, which has gotten like liquefied. And liquefied by I mean that, you have access to computing capabilities everywhere, right? That's the whole cloud computing and edge. And so if you add to that data power, softwareization and AI and machine learning and IoT and edge computing, that computing revolution is increasing the tech intensity in the system. And that has led to new ways by which we can use technology to create value. So that's one part of the story. And clearly during the pandemic, it accelerated adoption of digital technology. And thank God we could have packages come to us. But if you actually think about it, things got inverted. Suddenly the campus came to me. We're talking about education. Suddenly the hospital came to me. That's telehealth. So me on the yellow side, I'm starting to experience, wait a minute, food comes to me, I don't need to go anywhere. Education is here, which is leading to, and we can talk about this, a whole new future of work, because people want to now define where and how they want to work, live, play, and so on. So there's a live and play, but also I think it's going to transform professional work. But let's keep that aside. Going back to your question, kind of through that 4 industrial revolutions, you see the shift. But then I think the pandemic has forced this inversion, if you will. We talk about flipped classrooms now. So people are become more acutely aware that we got to now think about it the other way. Because we talk about B2B2C, now you got to go the other way, right? C2B2B. So that's one part of the story.
Yes. If I want to rephrase what you're saying about the pandemic, what I'm hearing you say is the technology made it possible to do a lot of things that the pandemic forced the experiencers' behavior to adapt. I'm thinking maybe that was the inhibitor of the adoption of these things that technology made possible. But in the pandemic, we have to accept learning from home. We have to accept receiving from home.
Yeah, there's no going back. Absolutely. But when you say it forced, of course, behavioral change on the yellow side as experiences. So there are a couple of things which is important for listeners. When I say experiencer, it's important not to just associate it with consumers and customers. When I say experiencer, I mean every individual who has an experience in the system. So it could be the customer, could be the consumer, could be the employee, it could be the decision maker, the manager. The people on the blue side are also experiencers, right? Because they experience all of this, the data scientist, the developer, the product manager. So when I talk about experiencers, it's very important to shed this traditional notion of the customer at the end of the chain and so on, because we are really living in a world of networks. So if you're thinking about healthcare as an example, right? Yes, it's the patient as the experiencer. But the point is, when you think about interactions, on the other side of that interaction is the caregiver. Caregivers had to very quickly figure out, okay, we have limited bed capacity. We have triaged this and decide, should this person be seen by a doctor, urgent care? In other words, it's a whole series of experiences that get triggered. And that's very important to understand and look at it in this kind of threaded way, which are enabled by what are called digital threads on the technology side, is essentially the customer experience being connected with various other experiences from the ecosystem side. So it really requires, like you said, cognitive shift, mind shift, because you really have to start thinking in ecosystems, in networks, which we traditionally are not used to. We might draw some maps of nodes and links, but we're not constantly thinking about it that way. So that's the whole shift, which therefore forced companies to now start thinking about these things. And if you look at what has actually happened, there are various studies, but like 20% of them are called leapfroggers, right? There were always the leaders who had invested in technology before. Other people were kind of forced there, dragging their feet into it. But then there were people who realized, wait a minute, now coming back to strategy, right? Wait a minute, these are like huge strategic opportunities, because now that I see this, it's sticky, it's not going away. The investments I made, I can now leverage them and actually reimagine my strategy, because now I have new market opportunities, new ways of engaging with customers and employees. And also it forced companies, this is another key point, to really think about where the inside meets the outside, right? We always talk about outside in and inside out, right? Those boundaries are very blurry. So for example, in creating vaccines, pharma companies realize they have to actually pair data scientists with people in the field, because you have to increase the speed with which you bring the vaccine out. And if you're like Moderna and you had mRNA capabilities, great, but you're still going through these trials so fast. In fact, it's amazing how fast the vaccines were rolled out. So it's also that this tech intensity has intensified the rate of information and communication in the system amongst those companies that have instituted those communication platforms. So as much about communication than information. And so to go back to your original question as to why is this shift occurring, this technology revolution is going to continue, the whole data revolution. But we really need to put the spotlight the other way around, from the experiencer to the ecosystem and back to the experiencer. So in other words, in the traditional world, the B2B2C, if you're thinking that way, you might say, okay, this is great. Let's now focus on this network. I got to manage all these partnerships, and let's think about the interaction from the network. to Kaihan back to the network. Okay, that's great. But Kaihan is saying, wait a minute, for me, I want to create a hugely personalized experience for myself. I want the network to cater to me, right? Because you have your own life to manage. So from your perspective, it's about Kaihan to the network back to Kaihan. So it's the individual to the network back to the individual. Both you have to see the yellow to blue back to yellow and the blue to yellow back to the blue. And so when you're thinking about optimizing the system and thinking about ways in which you make this better, this is where the cognitive shift occurs. I like that way of thinking about it. It's on both sides, right? In other words, it's like the patient experience interacting with the nurse and trying to explain the symptoms. It's also the nurse burdened with so many of these new interactions and making it easy for them to keep track of each patient, schedule appointments, and so on. So what I'm finding is that the tech companies in various ways are now also recognizing this opportunity and rolling out these new cloud and AI-enabled components, technology components, because now that there's demand from a B2B using traditional language from the technology company to everybody else, because all these companies have said, hey, we need these capabilities, right? So I'm seeing some very interesting things happening in terms of like the technology companies providing a lot of these components, technology components, tools, platforms, which are cloud-enabled, right? Their clients can in turn take the perspective we've been talking about and optimize it in the way in which they can create more value for the customers, employees, partners, and their stakeholders. So to me, you have to step back and zoom out and look at like, this is what is happening and ask yourself, okay, what does it mean for me in the business that I'm in?
Yes. I have so many questions, and I know we have limited time with you for this podcast. So when you're talking about this rapid feedback from the experiencer to the provider and the customization, those two combined, was that what you referred to in co-creation? Can you tell us what your definition of co-creation is?
So Kaihan, one of my thumb rules is not to use that word until the other person does. So if you notice, I never use that word, but truly that is really what it is. The reason why I don't use it up front is if you start thinking about co-creation, people gravitate towards co-creating products and services in the B2B2C world because there was co-creation before, right? But the true co-creation we're talking about really starts with the experience. So you're absolutely right. So that's really what I mean by co-creation. That is that interactional creation of these experienced outcomes and impacts from these resource capabilities that I engage with in the ecosystem. So it's really taking that yellow experience first, experiencer-centered perspective.
I think there's a Zen koan around a fish not knowing water. And I think that I, at least, have grown up with this linear view. Inputs, add value, delivery to B, then B to C, So if we have to make this cognitive shift, I'm sure there are lots of implications of this, but in your experience, what is the big cognitive leap that we need to make if we think about a chief strategy officer looking to help their leadership make the cognitive shift? What have you seen as the barrier, and what's a good way of helping people step into the new cognition?
There are a number of barriers, but let's assume that you understand that, you need to have all of this digital technology-based capability. So let's keep that aside. Culturally, in a lot of organizations, what happens is that we've been trained to think about value creation in terms of like goods and services. So, if you take education, right? We have lots of discussion about courses and programs, and it's such a deep mindset because we think about pricing programs. Right? So all of our revenue, top line, bottom line is all conditioned by traditional notions of customer relationships and using, business model canvas tools and things like that. Now, there's nothing wrong with those tools per se, but the underlying thinking is you're applying them to various activities in the system, trying to optimize it. And you don't take the perspectives that we've been talking about, because if you did that first and it opened up these new avenues for growth, then you can start to say, okay, what is the operating model I want to have in there? But I think we gravitate too fast to existing ways of thinking about products and services and creating value from that because we haven't first engaged in this more ecosystem thinking, but I would say not just ecosystem, but really looking at creating value interactionally. We have to think about how interactions create value and not like how we as institutions want to do that.
Okay, great. Oh my gosh. I know we've reached the top of our time here, but just getting a company to shift from goods and services to experience, to embrace this ecosystem mindset, to move towards creating value through interactions. It feels almost like when humans realize that maybe, this is an exaggeration, but when we realize that, hey, maybe the earth goes around the sun rather than the sun going around the earth, there are a whole bunch of implications and assumptions that then get questioned as we make those shifts about industries. We got to look at Porter's 5 forces in that context. We got to look at lots of strategic assumptions.
Yeah, and there are lots of assumptions. For example, I'll give you one because you had also asked a question to me earlier, which is what do people usually get wrong? And I think it's this that we think that efficiency can't be coupled with like contextualization, personalization, right? This whole innovation process. In the traditional world, in the world of atoms, yes, that was the case. But today, every company is a digital company, it's a software company, and the tech companies are actually creating industry clouds, providing all of these tools that you can take and plug into your system, right? And as you're developing this, it's actually affording people, when I say people, I mean businesses, the abilities to take and leverage these capabilities as a service that's been provided, software as a service to you, right? But the challenge is that if you still have the mindset, you don't understand, for example, that there is really not a trade-off between efficiency and contextualization, that you can actually now create highly unique, personalized experiences for Kaihan at low cost. That wasn't possible before.
Yes, it's always been a trade-off.
And so once you grasp that and you see it, what I find is executives start to really see the power of this. If you look at all of the success stories, you will find that all these companies, all the way from the Amazons to the Teslas to even Starbucks, Nike, you can go down all of these companies that have made these investments and have seen the benefits, and we discuss pharma company examples. Once you see that, and they'll talk about how once that flywheel keeps moving, you can start to be in, and then it will just erode like all these traditional questions of what business are we in, and what business is Amazon in, or Google in, because now you don't have all these traditional boundaries anymore. It's really, can you leverage capabilities that, again, you don't have to own. So it's, can you integrate in capabilities? How fast can you do that? You might build some of the capabilities yourself. And those are strategic questions. But fundamentally, it's leveraging all these capabilities as a service to really unlock all of these new opportunities. And once you see that and taste it and you know it and it starts to get embedded in the organization and you've built all of those structures and culture and all of the traditional strategy management concepts hold, right? But once you have seen what's needed and you have redesigned the interactions and the organizational structures where fundamentally you're giving agency to the yellow, right? And that's the new structure. Once you have done that and you give them that interactive agency and the power of it, you say, wait a minute, this is actually win-win. This is actually all win more. That's the true power of co-creation, is I create value for Kaihan, I create value for him in his ecosystem. It brings back value to me. So it's the shift from thinking about your value chain to the other's value chain, whether it's the partner's value chain or the customer's value chain, the employee's value chain. And that's the shift. And then when you make those intersect, that's where you have magic, because that's where the value pie expands.
Wow, we've run out of time here. We haven't even talked about the metaverse and the implications of that. So this is just a first conversation. We'd love to have you back and continue and go deeper. How can people learn from you and connect with you who want to hear more?
Yeah, sure. So there are some resources on my website, venkatramaswamy.com.
We'll put that in the notes.
That's VENKAT, Venkat Ramaswamy, RAMASWAMY. Or just, venkatar@umich.edu, which is my email. Because I think you're right. So let me just leave people with the fact that we've really talked about the upside. There's a whole downside to this, which is it just opens up this huge, let me say, equally huge area of risk management. Why? Because in the old world, you control everything. There were very few points where you actually let loose. This is the exact opposite. You have just created huge points of vulnerability because we are in a world, the more people interact, cybersecurity is not just a one line item. It's fundamental. Privacy, security. All of those things are huge in terms of how you manage risk. So that's something else we can discuss in terms of if you can manage all of those new risks that you have to deal with simultaneously as you manage all these different stakeholders. If you can do that, there are really literally infinite opportunities. So it's really this balance, again, back to strategy, being a strategy podcast. So I just said that the opportunity space has changed, the resource space has changed. We talked about that, how to connect the two. But now the space of risk has changed, right? And we fundamentally talk about risk reward. Well, yes, there is an upside, but be prepared to simultaneously manage all strategic risks, from brand risk, supply chain risks. Supply chain risk is huge today. Operational risks. There are lots of risks that now actually you have to deal with, which you didn't have to before.
Yeah, because we're going to have to deal with a multitude of permutations of interactions and experiences. Fascinating. Venkat, thank you so much for the work you do and for sharing it with us here. I really encourage people to follow you and read more, and we'd love to have you back to continue the conversation at some point.
Thank you, Kaihan, and I wish every one of your listeners all the best in co-creating the future.
Lovely. Thank you.
Thank you to our guest. Thank you to our producers, Karina Reyes and Zach Nest, our editor, and the rest of the team. If you like what you heard, please follow, download, and subscribe. I'm your host, Kaihan Krippendorf. Thank you for listening. We'll catch you next week with another episode of Outthinkers.